The gurney wheeled through the trauma bay entrance at St. Michael's in Norfolk on a Tuesday at 0743, and the man on it had no voice. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb arrived from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center wrapped in layers of sterile sheets and institutional silence, his eyes moving, tracking the ceiling tiles, the fluorescent lights, the faces of people who would soon tell him no. Ashley Cooper was folding linens in the supply room when the emergency alert chimed overhead. Code yellow. Trauma intake. She didn't pause. Her hands continued their measured rhythm, creasing each blue sheet with the precision of someone who had folded trauma bandages in desert conditions, muscle memory translating linen into something predictable in a world that offered nothing but chaos. She pushed the supply cart to Trauma Bay 3, and that's where she saw him. Mid-40s. Scarred left side of his neck where shrapnel had taken his larynx 6 months prior. His eyes met hers for exactly 1.3 seconds, long enough to register recognition, long enough for her to understand he was reading her the same way. She set the linens on the counter and said nothing. The intake nurse was already calling for Dr. Pierce. Dr. Pierce arrived at Grand Rounds the next morning with his residents trailing behind him like ducklings, their white coats still crisp from the laundry. He stood outside Trauma Bay 3 and read the chart while the residents waited, pens poised over blank pages. Ashley was repositioning Marcus's for line, her movements economical, the kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly where everything needed to be before you moved. Pierce didn't acknowledge her. He spoke to the air, his voice carrying that particular cadence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Complex aortic injury. Possible graft rejection. Patient is non-communicative, which means informed consent becomes problematic. He flipped the page. We're not equipped for this level of complication. Too much liability. Too much risk. One resident scribbled notes. Another nodded. Ashley continued working. She didn't flinch. Pierce left the bay and moved to the nursing station. Within 3 hours, 7 doctors had evaluated Marcus Webb. 7. Each one found a reason to say no. Dr. Chen cited the neurological complications. Dr. Holloway said the vascular reconstruction was beyond current protocol. Dr. Morris pulled Pierce's concerns about informed consent and built on them like a legal argument. A visiting cardiac surgeon from Johns Hopkins examined him for 40 minutes, then handed the chart back to the intake coordinator and said, "Not here." "Not me." The infectious disease specialist worried about the timeline. The intensivist questioned whether aggressive intervention aligned with the patient's best interests when the patient couldn't communicate what his interests were. The trauma surgeon, the one person Ashley had hoped might push back, simply said the case required a primary care team, and no one had claimed him. 7 doctors. That afternoon, the nursing assignments went out on the whiteboard. Trauma Bay 3 had no primary nurse listed. Patients without primary nurses didn't get baths. Didn't get wound checks. Didn't get the kind of care that kept them alive. Ashley walked to the assignment board at 1447 and wrote her name next to Marcus Webb's bay. Underneath, she wrote her initials, AC. The charge nurse found her within minutes. "Cooper, you can't just volunteer for that. Pierce needs to approve staffing. I'm assigned. He'll call you in his office." He did. At 16:34, when the shift was ending, his voice came across the intercom requesting her presence. His office was on the 4th floor, overlooking the parking lot where rain had begun to drum against the windows. Ashley arrived in clean scrubs, her hair still in the same tight bun she'd worn since 0600. Pierce sat behind a desk that looked borrowed from a furniture catalogue, all dark mahogany and angles meant to project authority. "You understand this patient is high risk," he said. "Yes." "You understand that his nonverbal status creates liability issues that the hospital is not equipped to handle." "I understand." Her voice was level. Respectful. The voice of a nurse who knew her place. The voice she had perfected over 8 months of learning how to disappear. Pierce folded his hands. "One independent decision. That's all it takes. One nursing judgment call that I don't authorize, and you're terminated." Hospital policy. Security will escort you out. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. Are we clear? Crystal clear, doctor. She left his office at 16:41 and walked downstairs to Trauma Bay 3. The hospital smelled like bleach and something underneath it, antiseptic layered over human suffering, a scent that never quite washed out of your clothes. Marcus was asleep, his left arm in a brace, his breathing steady and mechanical through the ventilator beside his bed. Ashley pulled a chair next to him and Saturday. There were no rules against that. There were no rules that said a primary nurse couldn't sit in a quiet room at the end of her shift and watch her patient. At 21:37, Marcus woke. His eyes tracked the ceiling, then found her. The recognition was instant and complete. His right hand, the one without the four, moved across the blanket, trembling with effort, and his fingers pressed against the fabric of his own hospital gown. He was looking for something. Looking for pockets. Looking for the things a person carried. His eyes tracked back to Ashley and she understood. She stood and walked to the supply locker. Her own locker. Her personal items were there, the photograph of Ethan, the work tablet, and beneath the clean pair of scrubs she kept for emergencies, the folded flag. It was the size of a greeting card when compressed, the fabric worn soft from constant handling. Panamanian flag. It had belonged to Corporal David Vasquez, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines when he and Marcus had served together in Fallujah. David had been dead for 18 months. The flag had been folded into a triangle by his mother and placed in Marcus's hands at the service. Marcus had carried it every day since. Ashley unfolded the flag and smoothed it against the surface of Marcus's bed. The fabric released a smell, dust, diesel, and something like dust again. Marcus's eyes filled. He couldn't cry properly because his paralyzed vocal cords meant that grief stayed trapped in his body, manifesting only as the violent shaking of his right hand. She stood there. She didn't touch him. She didn't offer comfort in the way that nurses were trained to do. Instead, she folded the flag again, the exact way it had been folded, and pressed it into his right hand, the trembling hand, the hand that had performed field surgery on wounded Marines in a city named after ancient monuments and now existed primarily in his memory. "You're going to be okay," she said. Her voice was different then, just for a moment. It dropped about half an octave. The words weren't inflected as a question or hope. They were stated as intelligence from someone who had sat with soldiers in that exact state of broken paralysis and watched them walk out. Marcus blinked once. His fingers closed around the flag. Ashley left the trauma bay at 21:43 and sat in her vehicle for 23 minutes before driving home. Her apartment was in a nondescript building 12 minutes from St. Michael's. She'd chosen it specifically for that proximity, and for the fact that it had a secure parking garage where her Department of Defense vehicle registration wouldn't be visible from the street. Inside, she poured coffee, black, no sugar, and pulled open her laptop. The screen came alive with encrypted messaging protocols. Her contact at JSOC had left a message at 18:56. Status on pharmaceuticals diversion ring. Anything new from Pierce's department? She typed back, patient arrived who may trigger investigation. Stand by. The message came back instantly, maintain cover. Mission priority. She closed the laptop. 18 months she'd been at St. Michael's as a civilian nurse, building her legend, inserting herself into the rhythm of the trauma ward. 18 months watching Dr. Pierce sign off on prescriptions that never reached pharmacy shelves, watching him build relationships with pharmaceutical suppliers that made no institutional sense, watching him establish himself as the kind of person who could be approached for problems that required discretion. The pharmaceutical diversion ring, the network that had stolen over $3 million worth of controlled substances from hospitals across Virginia and Maryland, had its fingers in Dr. Pierce's department. She was supposed to document it. Gather evidence. Prepare for NCIS and DEA intervention. Instead, she'd just signed on as primary nurse to a Green Beret who couldn't speak. Ashley opened the refrigerator. Inside, bottled water, oat milk, and the cold cut she'd prepared on Sunday. She made a sandwich she wasn't hungry for and ate it while standing at the kitchen counter, thinking about Marcus Webb's trembling hands and the way his eyes had changed when he recognized her. Thinking about the fact that he'd called her by a call sign she hadn't heard in 9 years. Thinking about the fact that JSOC protocols were very specific about what happened to operatives who allowed personal connections to compromise mission integrity. She finished the sandwich at 22:47 and prepared for sleep the way she did every night, stretching her left leg, the one that had taken shrapnel in at Hamya when a roadside device had detonated, checking the old scars on her wrists where 4 lines had infiltrated during a hospital evacuation. The scars had faded to white lines that only she could see. The limp remained. The limp was part of the legend. The limp was why everyone at St. Michael's assumed she was just a trauma nurse with some kind of past, nothing more specific than that. Her phone buzzed at 23:01. Another message from JSOC. Confirm patient information. Why the mission interest? Ashley didn't respond. Instead, she set an alarm for 0530 and closed her eyes. In her dreams, she was in Baghdad again, in a field hospital made of sandbags and determination, and Marcus Webb was whole, and neither of them were pretending to be something other than what they'd always been. Tuesday morning came fast. Ashley arrived at St. Michael's at 0547 and went directly to Trauma Bay 3. Marcus was awake, the flag clutched in his right hand, his eyes tracking her the moment she stepped through the door. She began the intake assessment, vital signs, wound inspection, for line verification, medication review. All of it by the book. All of it protocol that Pierce would have no reason to question. As she worked, Marcus's eyes never left hers. He was trying to speak, she could see the effort in his neck, the way his mouth formed shapes that his paralyzed larynx couldn't translate to sound. She kept working. She didn't react. She was excellent at not reacting. By noon, she understood that keeping Marcus alive was going to require breaking at least 17 hospital protocols. By sunset, she understood that the JSOC mission she'd dedicated 18 months to was about to collapse. By 2200 hours, she understood that Marcus Webb had not survived Baghdad only to die in a hospital while she prioritized paperwork. Sometimes you choose. Sometimes the choice chooses you. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's already made every decision before anyone realized a decision needed to be made. Dr. Pierce made his first move on a Tuesday morning in the cardiothoracic conference room, 47 residents and attending physicians packed shoulder to shoulder as he pulled up Ashley's patient chart on the projector screen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in clinical white. "Let me show you what happens when nurses think they're doctors," he began, his voice carrying the particular tone of academic contempt, the kind that makes junior residents hold their breath. Ashley sat in the back row, her trauma shears clipped to her pocket, the metal catching the light. Pierce clicked to the imaging. Nurse Cooper here decided to intubate a trauma patient without consulting the attending. She bypassed the entire chain of command because she assessed the situation as, and I quote from her note, critical. He paused, letting the implication settle. The patient had survived. The airway had been textbook perfect. None of that mattered. Protocol exists for a reason. We cannot have Florence Nightingale here making independent decisions in my hospital. His voice moved like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, impossible to ignore. The resident scribbled notes. Ashley's jaw tightened. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her face showed nothing. That was the thing about composure under fire. It looked like weakness to people who'd never been shot at. 2 days later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, Pierce positioned himself deliberately. Ashley heard his voice before she saw him, that same tank engine tone, but now directed at 3 interns hovering near the coffee selection. I'm not saying her credentials are fake, he was saying, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. I'm just saying, has anyone actually verified where she trained? Because I've worked with hundreds of nurses, and this one just appears 8 months ago with no references, no background, no explanatory trail. Someone should check. For patient safety. The interns glanced sideways at Ashley as she approached the machine. She selected black coffee. Paid 95 cents in exact change. Pierce watched her with the expression of a man who expected to see shame, or anger, or some visible crack in her composure. Ashley turned and walked back down the corridor without breaking stride, her hand steady on the cup, her badge swinging against her ribs with each step. The vending machine scene was strategic. Clever. Pierce understood that public humiliation works better than private confrontation, that spreading doubt through conversation is more effective than direct accusation. He was competent in his cruelty. That was what made him dangerous. By the following week, the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. Nurses avoided her in the break room. One attending physician asked to review her charting on a routine post-op patient, his tone suggesting he was checking for fraud rather than quality assurance. The looks from the junior staff carried questions they weren't asking out loud. Pierce had planted the seed perfectly, that Ashley Cooper's credentials couldn't be trusted, that her decision-making was unstable, that she was fundamentally unsafe. Then the code in the ICU happened. Room for 12, acute decompensation, patient crashing, the on-call resident frozen at the monitor while the monitor screamed its warnings. Ashley made the call, epinephrine at the 4-minute mark, textbook timing, by-the-book protocol, and the patient's heart responded. Sinus rhythm returned. The crisis reversed. Ashley had just proven herself exactly the kind of nurse Pierce was claiming was a threat. Pierce arrived as they were stabilizing the patient, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Nurse Cooper. My office. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in front of the entire ICU staff. His office smelled of leather and expensive cologne. The door was open, that was deliberate too, so the hallway could hear every word. Pierce sat behind his desk, leaving Ashley standing. She recognized the power play. She'd seen it before, in a different context, in different uniforms, in different war rooms. The principle remained identical. One more independent decision without my explicit authorization, and security will escort you out of this building. His voice had dropped now, conversational, almost friendly. That made it worse. "Do you understand me? I don't care how many patients you think you're saving. This is my hospital, and you follow my protocols or you leave. No exceptions. No heroics. No independent thinking." He leaned back in his chair, watching her face. Waiting for the crack. Ashley's response came barely above a whisper, "Yes, doctor." Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't water. Her breathing remained steady. But inside, every tactical part of her mind was calculating the damage. 2 years. 2 years of cultivation as a civilian nurse, carefully building her cover at St. Michael's, positioning herself inside the pharmacy diversion investigation, getting close enough to document the trafficking network. 2 years of reports sent through the military encrypted line hidden inside a locked phone in her apartment, reports only JSOC knew about, reports that were building the case that would eventually bring down the operation. And Pierce, with his arrogance and his need to control, was about to blow it all apart. The following morning, Pierce summoned her again. This time his office was sterile and official. On his desk lay a termination letter, already drafted, already signed by hospital administration. 3 formal complaints were paperclipped to the top, practicing beyond scope of nursing license, unauthorized performance of medical procedures, and gross insubordination. But the 4th item made her stomach drop. A records request, filed with the State Nursing Board, requesting a complete verification of Ashley's credentials, her licensing history, her background check results. "I've requested a full investigation into your nursing license," Pierce said, sliding the documentation across his desk toward her. His face wore the expression of a man who believed he'd won. "Given some questions that have arisen about your background, the board is going to want to verify everything. Until that investigation is complete, your employment is suspended effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and your access codes today." He smiled. "I'm confident they'll find some interesting inconsistencies." Ashley stared at the termination letter. The irony was precise and devastating. Pierce's records request, intended to expose her as a fraud, would trigger a federal cross-check. Any serious investigation into Captain Ashley Cooper's background would eventually reach the Pentagon. It would reach JSOC. It would expose her actual military designation, her actual mission, her actual identity. The pharmaceutical diversion investigation would collapse the moment her cover was blown. The trafficking network she'd spent 24 months documenting would scatter like roaches when the light came on. "I understand," Ashley said quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't defend herself, because defending herself would require telling the truth, and the truth would destroy everything. Instead, she accepted the letter, removed her hospital badge, and walked out of Pierce's office with her composure intact. But that wasn't what happened inside. That night, in the hospital locker room after her shift officially ended, Ashley folded her scrubs with the same precision she'd once used on her military uniform. The blue fabric was still warm from the day. She creased each sleeve with methodical care, folding the edges perfectly parallel. Then she folded the torso, bringing the shoulders together, creating clean lines. Her hands performed the ritual without trembling, but her mind was calculating the wreckage. The pharmaceutical operation would continue without her. The dealers would keep operating. The trafficking network would keep moving product through St. Michael's, through the pharmacy supply chain, distributing opioids to the streets of Norfolk and beyond. 24 months of surveillance, gone. Hundreds of hours of documentation, scattered. The network she'd infiltrated, the dealers she'd identified, the suppliers she'd tracked, all of it would slip away because Dr. Pierce needed to prove he was the smartest person in the room. And Marcus. The green beret in room 347, the man with her mission scrawled across his face because he'd been assigned to the same forward operating base, the same unit, the same war. He'd arrive for surgery tomorrow or the next day, and every doctor in this hospital had already refused him. 7 doctors. 7 refusals. Now there would be no primary nurse fighting to keep him on the case, no one translating his needs because he couldn't speak them, no one who understood what it meant to be a soldier without a voice. She placed the folded scrubs in the laundry bin, pressing them down gently as if tucking someone into bed. The fabric settled beneath other discarded shifts, other nurses' work, other hours given away. Ashley had spent 18 years, 5 in the Army Medical Corps, 13 in JSOC operations, understanding that sacrifice meant keeping quiet, meant accepting losses without explanation, meant walking away from the mission because the mission was bigger than her pride. She'd taught her son that honor meant doing the right thing even when no one would ever know you'd done it. She'd written casualty notifications in her own handwriting, soldiers' names, soldiers' families, all those quiet deaths that the world never counted. But standing in the locker room, looking at her badge in her hand, she understood that sometimes the cost of silence became too high. Sometimes the person you're protecting is also the person you're betraying. She placed her badge on the bench. She turned toward the door. And that's when her phone vibrated against her hip, a text from an unknown number, the kind of message she never received because nobody knew how to reach her except JSOC, except command, except the people who'd put her inside St. Michael's in the first place. The text message read, "Cardinal compromised. Exfil Protocol Alpha. Acknowledge." Ashley's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what that single message meant. 2 years undercover at St. Michael's. 23 months monitoring a pharmaceutical diversion ring that moved through the ICU like an infection nobody could trace. 3 weeks away from the final supplier connection that would dismantle the entire network. Gone. All of it, gone, because Dr. Pierce had filed a credentials request that would expose her civilian identity and blow the operation wide open. She didn't acknowledge the message. Not yet. The night stretched ahead like a countdown she couldn't stop. At 2,247 hours, she stood in the break room watching the monitor feeds on her personal laptop, the one she wasn't supposed to have access to, the ones JSOC had installed during her placement. Marcus's room filled the screen. Room 347. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, the ventilator wheezed its rhythmic cadence, and his heart rate climbed steadily on the monitor. 110. 115. 120. The folded flag sat on his bedside table under the fluorescent lights, a small square of fabric that had cost someone everything. Dr. Holloway's team had come through at 7 o'clock. For minutes. They checked vitals, written notes, and left. No conversation. No hand on the shoulder. No human being acknowledging the man underneath the machines. Marcus had spent 6 months unable to speak after shrapnel took his voice in Kandahar, and tonight he was alone with the sound of his own failing heart. The phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. Command holding. Final decision window, 48 hours. She turned the phone face down on the break room table. At 01 for 7 hours, the ICU erupted in alarms. Ashley was moving before her conscious mind registered the sound, muscle memory from a dozen combat saves, her feet already crossing the threshold toward the stairs. The alarm screamed its specific pattern, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all dropping in synchronized collapse. The night shift nurse, Coleman, was already running code protocols through the intercom. Dr. Holloway, Trauma 347. Patient Webb. Ruptured surgical site. Blood pressure 73/40 and dropping. The on-call resident arrived first. A man named Garrett, competent on paper, paralyzed in the moment when the machines told him his patient was dying. He stood in the doorway of room 347 staring at the monitors as if they might recalibrate themselves if he concentrated hard enough. The monitor showed the problem immediately, a post-operative hemorrhage, blood pooling where the aortic graft had given way. Not slow. Not controllable through standard protocol. This was a cascade. "Get me blood products," Garrett said, his voice cracking. 2 units O negative, stat. Call Dr. Pierce. Dr. Pierce isn't responding, Coleman said. I've paged 3 times. 70 seconds. That was the window. Blood loss at this rate meant cardiac arrest in 90 seconds maximum. Ashley was scrubbed and moving before the thought completed itself. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. In a convoy outside Fallujah where her medic partner had taken shrapnel through the femoral artery and the nearest surgical team was 8 minutes out. Pain is data. Data becomes action. She didn't ask permission. The mask went on, gloves snapped like gunshots against her wrists, and she moved to the bedside with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Garrett's hands were shaking. She didn't need him. Trauma scalpel. 14-gauge needle. Satin sky clamp if we have it, vascular clamp if we don't, Ashley said. The voice that came out wasn't the deferential nurse Pierce had spent 8 months trying to break. This voice came from deeper. From Baghdad. From sand and blood and the specific knowledge of what human bodies could endure if you moved fast enough. You can't, that's not, Garrett started. She was already opening the surgical field. A field thoracotomy, done on the narrow table with the light angled wrong and the equipment scattered, but her hands didn't shake. They moved with the precision of muscle memory older than her civilian identity. She found the aorta. She found the rupture. Blood like copper smell filling the room. She clamped. The bleeding stopped. Garrett's face had gone the color of old hospital walls. Coleman stood frozen, still holding the blood products. The monitor steadied. 105. 100. 98. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Call surgical, Ashley said quietly. Tell them we've got temporary containment on an aortic rupture. They've got maybe 15 minutes before this clamp slips. Move. The surgical team arrived in 11 minutes. Dr. Hayes took one look at what she'd done, the field stabilized, the hemorrhage contained, the graft temporarily clamped with precision that shouldn't have been possible without a full team and proper equipment, and said nothing. He just began removing gloves and nodding at his residents. They moved into the space she'd cleared like they were taking over a secured position. She stepped back. Hand steady. Breathing controlled. No one who watched her leave would have seen a trace of the woman who'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. At 0705 hours, Ashley was still wearing yesterday's scrubs when Dr. Pierce found her in the corridor outside the blood bank. He was wearing his white coat like a weapon, the termination letter already in his hands, and his face carried the expression of a man who'd been woken at 5 in the morning by surgical staff asking him why the hell his patient was still alive. "My office." "Now," he said. The office smelled like expensive cologne and power concentrated in square footage. Pierce sat behind his desk with the morning light making his expression deliberately theatrical. "You performed a surgical procedure at 01 for 7 hours without authorization, without physician presence, and without informed consent from a patient who cannot consent verbally. Do you understand what that means?" Ashley didn't sit. Standing gave her the advantage. She could see the fear underneath his anger, the dawning realization that she'd done something impossible and survived it. "It means your patient is alive," she said quietly. "It means you're finished." Pierce opened a drawer and produced 3 documents, placing them on the desk with deliberate precision. Termination, effective immediately. Scope of practice violation. And this, he tapped the credentials request form, which the Board of Nursing will be processing. "I suspect they'll find some very interesting discrepancies in your background." Ashley looked at the papers without touching them. She'd known this was coming. The JSOC briefing had prepared her for exposure, but not for the feeling of watching a 2-year operation collapse because she'd chosen a man over a mission. "You're not to return to this facility," Pierce continued. "Security will escort you out. Your final paycheck will be mailed to the address on file. Are we clear, Ms. Cooper?" She met his eyes. In another life, in another uniform, she would have saluted. Instead, she turned and walked out of his office with the kind of composure that would have impressed a drill sergeant. 43 seconds later, she was standing in the employee locker room, collecting the few personal items she'd allowed herself to keep: a photograph of her son, a challenge coin from her unit, a spare pair of socks. The scrubs came off in the laundry room at 0815 hours. She folded them with the same precision she'd once used on her Army combat uniform, each sleeve creased perfect, the fabric laid flat, the weight of the gesture pressing down like a physical force. These were the scrubs she'd been wearing when she'd held Marcus's hand through his first night at St. Michael's. When she'd recognized him as Ghost One, the medic who'd replaced her in Baghdad. When she'd decided that some missions couldn't be completed because some people mattered more than operations. The laundry bin swallowed them whole. Security walked her to the parking lot with an escort that felt more like punishment than protocol. The morning had turned grey, the kind of Norfolk weather that comes off the water heavy and cold. Her phone sat silent in her pocket. Command holding. Final decision window, 48 hours. She hadn't acknowledged the message. Hadn't responded to the exfil protocol. That particular choice, the one that made her a deserter from her own operation, hadn't been made yet. But standing in the parking lot of St. Michael's with 2 years of undercover work collapsing behind her, watching security disappear back through the doors, she knew the answer already. It was written in the memory of Marcus's eyes finding hers through the glass of his room. It was written in the knowledge that Ghost One had lost his voice trying to do exactly what she'd just done. She got in her car and drove toward the river, not looking back. The rain started before she reached the highway, hammering the windshield like applause for a performance nobody would ever know she'd given. Her phone would ring soon enough. Questions would come. Consequences would follow. But for this moment, accelerating into the grey morning with the rain erasing the hospital from her rearview mirror, Ashley Cooper, Captain Cooper, Ghost 6, the woman with a son who didn't know his mother was a soldier, chose the one mission that mattered more than any operation. She chose to be human. Ashley was clearing her locker at 0730 when the staff entrance doors slammed open like a gunshot, metal hinges screaming against their brackets, and her 15-year-old son burst through the security checkpoint moving faster than protocol allowed. Ethan's face was flushed, desperate, his breathing ragged. He was holding something against his chest like it was made of glass. The shadow box. Her shadow box. The one she kept in a locked trunk at home, beneath winter clothes and old photographs, containing the medals she'd earned in a life she'd promised never to speak about. "Mom, stop. You have to stop leaving." His voice cracked across the hallway, echoing off the tile, drawing heads from every corner of the ICU. They need to see these. They need to know. Ashley's hands froze mid-motion inside the locker. The photograph of Ethan from last summer, his grin, his innocence still intact, fell to the floor. She moved toward him, her voice dropping to the register she reserved for incoming trauma. Ethan, you need to leave. Right now. We discussed this. You cannot be here. But the universe doesn't operate on what should happen. It operates on what does. The ambulance bay doors opened at that exact moment, 07 for 2 hours, and Marcus Webb's gurney rolled past, the transfer to Walter Reed finally happening, 48 hours after the thoracotomy had pulled him back from the edge of death. His body was still bandaged heavily across the chest, still tethered to a portable ventilator that hissed with mechanical precision, still unconscious. Still mute. But his eyes opened as the gurney passed Ashley, and they locked on hers with the weight of shared history, two soldiers who had stood in the same Baghdad trauma bay, who had held the same bleeding soldiers, who had made the same impossible choices. His mouth moved. Sound came out. Actual sound. Words formed in a voice that hadn't existed for 6 months, a voice that had been burned away by shrapnel and shock and silence. Ghost 6. The call sign hung in the hallway like a grenade with the pin pulled, spinning slowly through the air, waiting to detonate. Ghost 6. The name she'd worn in Baghdad when she was a different person, a person with a rank and a purpose and a unit patch sewn into the collar of her uniform. The name only soldiers knew. Only people who'd been there, who'd seen what she'd seen, who'd bled beside her could possibly know. The Marine escort lieutenant pushing the gurney froze mid-stride. He looked down at his tablet, confusion rippling across his features, then back at Ashley with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were standing on the wrong floor of the hospital. He checked the tablet again, checked the paperwork attached to the gurney frame, and began reading aloud in the formal voice of official documentation, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb. Authorized transfer to Walter Reed. Receiving unit, 75th Combat Support Hospital. He looked up. His eyes found the shadow box in Ethan's hands. Patient is accompanied by Captain Ashley Cooper's authorization packet. Captain. The lieutenant's posture straightened imperceptibly. United States Army Medical Corps, assigned Joint Special Operations Command. Bronze Star with Valor. His voice deepened with each word, formal and measured, the tone of a man reading a hero's biography. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Documented 73 lives saved under active combat conditions in Baghdad, Anbar Province, April 2009 through December 2010. Nurses in the hallway stopped moving entirely. A crash cart 2 bays down stopped being pushed. A resident walking past froze mid-stride, phone halfway to his ear. Dr. Pierce pushed through the growing crowd with the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. This is hospital property, you need to leave, security will handle this, there's been some kind of mistake with the paperwork. His voice had taken on the sharp edge of panic, the tone of someone who'd just realized the ground beneath him was cracking. The elevator dinged. Major General William Kessler emerged in full dress uniform, the kind of uniform that made everything else in the hallway look like costumes. 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders like polished steel. His uniform was pressed with military precision, and his bearing was the kind that made young doctors instinctively straighten their spines. His eyes swept the hallway once, fast and clinical, cataloging the scene with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats and assets in seconds. His gaze found the shadow box. Saw the Bronze Star medal inside, pinned against dark velvet. Saw the purple ribbon. Saw what it meant. His spine rigidified into a posture that made Special Forces soldiers look relaxed. His right arm moved with the sharpness of a salute that could cut glass, the kind of salute given to officers who'd earned it in places where earning it meant coming home in pieces or not coming home at all. Captain Cooper served with the 75th Combat Support Hospital attached to Task Force 121 operations in Baghdad, Iraq. Her unit designation was Nightingale 7. His voice carried down the entire corridor like a command, like an official statement being entered into the record of history. 73 documented lives saved under direct fire. 3 separate commendations for battlefield surgical medicine under combat conditions. Phones came out. Residents started filming. The hallway had become a courtroom, and nobody had planned for the trial. Pierce's face drained of color. All of it. Every drop of blood seemed to evacuate from his head at once, leaving him looking like a wax figure of himself, something manufactured and hollow. There's been a mistake. She's a nurse. A trauma nurse. I have her credentials right here in my office, I can pull them for you. A woman in a dark suit emerged from the elevator behind General Kessler, moving with the economical precision of federal authority. Pentagon credentials hung from a lanyard around her neck, gold and official and impossible to argue with. Her eyes were the color of someone who'd read too many classified files to waste time on small talk. Captain Cooper's assignment to St. Michael's was authorized under Classified Operational Directive 2024 the JSOC for 47. Her voice had the flat quality of someone reading documentation, but beneath it was the understanding that documentation was power. She is currently listed as active duty with Joint Special Operations Command, undercover designation Nightingale 7. Her nursing credentials are genuine. Her assignment here was genuine. And her undercover pharmaceutical investigation has been terminated effective immediately due to institutional security breach. She turned to face Dr. Pierce directly. You initiated a credential investigation 6 hours ago. That investigation triggered an automated security review in the Pentagon's JSOC office. My team has been auditing St. Michael's pharmaceutical records since 0200 this morning. She paused, letting that sink in like a weight dropping into water. We've documented 47 instances of opioid diversion from controlled substance storage. All traceable to credential access patterns matching your badge number. All occurring during your shifts. All meticulously recorded in the very hospital system you demanded we audit. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ventilator hissing on Marcus's gurney, could hear the fluorescent lights humming their low electronic prayer, could hear the sound of Dr. Pierce's career ending in real time. It wasn't a shout or a confrontation. It was the quiet sound of institutional power recognizing what had always been there, a soldier standing in a hallway in scrubs, blood dried on the cuffs, holding her son's hand while a teenager held his mother's medals like they were made of light. Ethan's hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the understanding that he was standing inside a moment that mattered, that his mother was being seen, actually seen, for the first time since she'd put on scrubs and walked into a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, to investigate criminals while pretending to be someone ordinary. The shadow box was getting heavy in his arms, but he didn't put it down. Ashley's jaw had tightened into a line that could cut steel. She wasn't looking at the general or the Pentagon investigator or Dr. Pierce's collapsing expression. She was looking at Marcus Webb, at the way his eyes had found hers again, at the confirmation passing between them in that ancient language of soldiers, the acknowledgement that they'd both survived something that was never supposed to be survived, that they'd chosen their patients over themselves, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe noticed. She reached out and took the shadow box from Ethan's hands without a word. Her fingers found the medals inside, the Bronze Star, the Purple Hearts, the Combat Medical Badge, and for a moment, standing in the hallway of St. Michael's Hospital in Norfolk, Captain Ashley Cooper let herself be seen as something other than a nurse. Let herself be recognized as someone who'd held dying soldiers, who'd made impossible choices under fire, who'd saved lives when saving them meant breaking every rule that tried to contain her. And when she looked back up at the general, her eyes had changed color. Not literally. But in every other way that mattered, in the way she held her shoulders, in the way her breathing had deepened and steadied, in the way her voice dropped an octave as she spoke for the first time, "Thank you, sir. But I wasn't finished with my patient." The Pentagon audit team sealed Dr. Pierce's office by 0900 hours. 3 investigators in charcoal suits moved through the space like they owned it, photographing every document, every prescription pad, every file drawer while the morning light cut through the windows in hard geometric lines. Hospital administration sat frozen in the conference room, watching the pieces fall. The pharmaceutical records Pierce had demanded to discredit Ashley, the ones he'd filed through official channels, certain they would expose her credentials as fabricated, had triggered an automatic Department of Defense security review. A review that found something far more interesting than a fraudulent nurse. 15 months of opioid prescriptions. Morphine, fentanyl, hydromorphone. Written for post-surgical patients who'd been discharged weeks earlier or buried 6 months prior. The medications existed only on paper, the prescriptions diverted through a pharmacy connection in Virginia Beach, the money routed through shell accounts. All meticulously documented. All perfectly traceable. The same bureaucratic precision Pierce had weaponized to build his case against her had created an evidence trail so clear that federal prosecutors could walk it blindfolded. By noon, the Virginia Medical Board had suspended his license pending criminal investigation. By 1400 hours, federal marshals walked him out through the same lobby where he'd humiliated Ashley, past the same residents who'd watched him mock her credentials at grand rounds, his hands empty of everything except a property receipt and the crushing realization that he'd destroyed himself trying to destroy someone he'd never understood. The elevator doors closed on him like a mouth swallowing. Ashley stood in the hallway still wearing civilian clothes, no badge clipped to her scrubs anymore, technically still fired according to the hospital's records, though that termination letter was being shredded in legal's office as the investigation expanded. The JSOC investigator briefed her in a stairwell, voice low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Your cover's blown but the mission isn't lost. Pierce's arrest gave us the pharmacy connection you were tracking. The surveillance data you collected during those 8 months, it's gold now. We have enough to roll up the entire network. 47 arrests across 3 states. For years of diversion dismantled because one arrogant surgeon had tried to prove that a competent woman couldn't possibly be real. Ashley nodded once. She'd already known. The operation had been successful the moment Marcus Webb whispered her call sign in that hallway. Everything after that was extraction and documentation. Marcus Webb, stabilized post-surgery, was moved to a recovery room on the 4th floor where the windows faced the Elizabeth River and the light came in soft and amber in the late afternoon. Ashley finally sat beside him, no longer his nurse but the soldier who'd held the position before him in a war zone 8,000 miles away. He'd typed on a tablet in careful letters, "You taught the medic who trained me. Your field protocols. I used them for 6 months." The letters glowed against the screen like a confession. The folded flag he carried was from Corporal Jennifer Hayes, killed in the same mortar attack that took his voice. She'd been his patient in that field hospital outside Fallujah, and Ashley's former student in the combat medic course she'd taught before her JSOC assignment pulled her into deeper waters. 3 days later, the hospital board offered Ashley her job back with a formal apology written by lawyers who understood liability and public relations. She declined with a single email, "The position is filled." Ethan had brought her medals to that hallway because he was exhausted watching his mother fold scrubs instead of wearing the uniform she'd earned through blood and sacrifice and decisions made in the dark. He'd understood, in the way 15-year-olds sometimes do, that his mother had been hiding. Now she didn't have to anymore. 6 months later, Ashley stood in the JSOC briefing room at Fort Bragg in her dress uniform, the same medals Ethan had carried that day now properly mounted on her chest in ascending order of valor, the morning sun cutting through the high windows and painting everything the color of commitment. The operation's final report played on the projection screen like a silent film of consequence. Pharmaceutical network. 47 arrests. 3 states dismantled. The news footage followed, Dr. Pierce outside a community college in Richmond, credentials stripped, medical license permanently revoked, teaching CPR basics to bored students who checked their phones and doodled in their notebooks, his hands pressing down on plastic mannequins in a rhythm that would never save a life because saving lives required something he'd never possessed, the ability to see people clearly. The same man who demanded credentials now had none. The same hands that had signed termination papers now performed compressions on a doll. Marcus Webb attended the briefing in civilian clothes, his voice rebuilt through a combination of surgical reconstruction and speech therapy, speaking in a rasp that carried like gravel through water. "Captain Cooper saved my life twice, once in the hospital room when she didn't wait for permission, and once by training the medic who kept me alive in Baghdad when the world went red and loud." The room held absolutely still. On the wall behind Ashley hung 2 flags in shadow boxes, mounted side by side like testimony, her own flag from her deployment, the fabric worn from careful handling, and Marcus's gift, the flag from Corporal Hayes, the student she'd trained who died doing the work Ashley had taught her, her name embroidered in gold thread along the edge. General Kessler, 2 stars on each shoulder, presented Ashley with her new assignment, instructor position at the Army Medical Department at Fort Sam Houston, training the next generation of combat medics. No more hiding, no more cover identities, no more pretending to be anything less than what she was. The assignment began next month. Full rank, full recognition, full visibility. Ethan watched from the visitor gallery, his phone recording the moment his mother was finally visible, pride written across his 15-year-old face like calligraphy. The closing shot held steady, Ashley's hand resting on the shadow box containing both flags, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the room full of officers and medical personnel, her composure unshakable because she'd learned long ago that strength was silence before the world gave her permission to speak. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The camera held on the 2 flags mounted side by side, neither more important than the other, both carried by the nurse who'd refused to let either be forgotten, the medical officer who'd chosen competence over caution, the soldier who'd saved lives not because the protocols permitted it but because the moment demanded it. Outside the briefing room, the Fort Bragg morning hummed with the distant sound of helicopters warming their rotors for the day's missions. Inside, everyone in that room understood what they'd witnessed, not the redemption of one woman, but the reckoning of a system that had tried to silence her and failed. The medals on her chest caught the light and threw it back like small mirrors reflecting truth. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever watched integrity triumph over institutional corruption, if you've ever wondered what happens when the quiet person finally speaks, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Comment below, would you have done what Captain Cooper did, or would you have walked away? Like and share this story with someone who needs to know that sometimes the system corrects itself, sometimes justice arrives, and sometimes the hero is wearing scrubs. We'll see you in the next one.